and sort of go with that. So I'm just going to say this feels like a reasonable model. Yes. All right, so I'm just going to grab this one and say there's a few different, I guess, sort of ways that you can approach this. So the first one would be to go in and sort of systematically delete parts of your mesh to make clothes. So if I wanted to put, say, a t-shirt on this character, I could go through, I'm just going to duplicate this person, and go through and select all of the faces on the rib cage, and I'll just do each arm. And this is after it's posed. You could do it before you pose the character if you want. That does require a little bit more knowledge of weight painting and how a rig is actually set up. So if you're not comfortable with that, probably just pose your character and then add the clothes on afterwards. So in this case, I decided I'm going to throw on a t-shirt and some horrible bell-bottom pants, because I like bell-bottom pants. I have bad taste, don't judge me. All right, so we have this, and this is basically just parts of the person model just sort of hanging out. Ooh, God. Hello. All right. So what I'm going to do is make this pants line a little bit less insane. I'm just going to grab these vertices and just crush them down aggressively. At this point, what I'm going to do is just take the entire clothes mesh, extrude it, and then just sort of decide how thick I want it. Say maybe that's not completely awful, and call that a day. So at this point, you have some clothes that kind of conform to the body. It's not fantastic. It's also not the worst thing I've ever seen, I guess. If you want, you can go through and, I said, I promised you bell bottoms. I'm going to deliver you some bell bottoms. I'm going to delete the inside of this extruded piece. And I guess I'll do the same thing for the shirt as well. Probably should have done this before. So, tra-la-la. The awkward bits where I just sort of live model and need to click 80,000 things. All right, so now we have planes. So if I wanted to, I could go in and extend the t-shirt down. So I'm just going to grab this lower edge and maybe extrude that down and be like, awesome, it's a t-shirt. So this, oh God, what? That makes no sense. All right. But you can kind of scale things that way. And again, if you wanted to do, I could go in and sort of grab specific edges and force them to be a better shape. You can go down again for the pants. I can't click on the right things today, at all. Good Lord. No, I'm gonna regret that. All right. Jesus. All right. Pants, same thing, drag down. And then in this case, I'm just gonna sort of flare them out at the bottom. And then what I could do, if I was happy with this, is take it into, I'm gonna just do something sort of like that. Probably do a better job of shaping this than I am doing. But if you wanted to, you could then take this. Please, for the love of goodness, this is the worst way possible. This is not how shirts work. Only in anime do shirts work like this. So I'm just gonna run, what did I just attach that to? So I'm just gonna run through together and maybe make this shirt a little bit more physically accurate or something. Hooray. All right, you get the point. So avoid the super sketchy anime shirt look. So I'm just gonna grab this and do a file export and do a thing, bell bottoms. All right. So normally at this point, if I wanted to add in some sculpting detail, I would go into Zbrush. Again, you can do this in Mudbox or pretty much anything else. So I'm just gonna go document, new document. Don't save that. Import, and do this the same way I did previously. So I'm just gonna find my model, grab it, left click, and drag, and it should place your model somewhere in the scene. Unless Maya isn't done exporting this, which would be incredibly questionable. Great. Oh, right, because I put it, ZBrush I can't navigate ZBrush with a mouse. It's super awkward. So I'm actually just gonna drag this, put it a little bit closer to the origin. because I couldn't find it because it was dragging the model like all the way out to like some weird 100 units off. And again, feel free to stop me if you guys have any questions. I'm trying to be. Yes, you can do that.
Does it look good, or does it look janky?
I have seen people do amazing things with cloth simulations. I tried to do it the other day and my computer was like being super slow, but you can do clothes with cloth sims. It's definitely good for stuff like cloaks and things of that nature. It just depends. I don't know. It depends. I'd probably set up a cloth sim if I wanted a bunch of different clothes for things. It's also a little bit dodgier with supportless because if you do a cloth sim, you don't really have control over like the angles and stuff like that. But yeah, you can totally do a cloth sim if you're familiar with NCloth. Oh god. Okay, fine. All right, so I've dragged my models in. I'm gonna hit edit. If you guys do ever find yourself with multiple like bell-bottom extra stuff because you dragged in 2 copies, you can go to layer, and just usually there'll be like 1 extra layer. Just hit clear, and it's gonna get rid of that one, and then you can actually rotate around like a sane person. So if you're in Zbrush, rotating around your object, you can just click off to the side and sort of drag around. Panning back and forth is usually Alt, and then either the left or right mouse button. And then zooming is Control and the right mouse button. Control and left mouse button does masking, which I'm not really super gonna worry about today. All right, so usually, like I can't really sculpt on this because it's super, super low poly. So just go into your geometry tab and divide it. If any of those of you who have done stuff for animation, pretty much the same way. You just don't need to worry about doing like morph targets or anything like that. Just hit divide a few times. You can see that this is like definitely smoother looking now. It's also really highlighting my awful geometry in here. But then you can go in like you normally would and select different brushes and just sort of doodle on your model. Feel free again to go as high resolution as you need. So right now we're up to like, this is nothing in Zbrush. This isn't even 500,000 polys. But you can see that like the more resolution I give, again, the nicer that sculpt is. So you can go in and say, all right, so maybe I'm gonna, I don't know, like smooth out this horrible area around like here, because it looks terrible because of my geometry. But you can go in and like sculpt some details into the shirt like this. Let's see, so by default, Zbrush is going to make raised areas on your model. So like Z add is basically, again, like adding height or adding dimension to your model. If you want to basically like dig out a line instead of making a raised one, you can either press Alt and then drag, or you can just change the mode entirely to Z sub. And that is going to, if I switch to Z sub, by default, it's going to cut out or like make little divots in my model instead of adding geometry. And then if I hit Alt, it's going to actually make raised lines. So it's basically, those of you that are familiar with Photoshop, it's kind of like hitting X to like toggle back and forth between your colors, if that's helpful at all. But that's just using Alt, again, to sort of change the function you're doing. Smoothing in ZBrush, if you just press and hold Shift, it'll automatically toggle you to the smoothing brush. And you can smooth your model. Super high dense models tend to take longer to smooth. We can go in and, again, sort of like add detail this way. You can change the size of your brush, so there's like draw size up here if you want like little bitty creases. I'm gonna put this back to add. And then you can also change, focal shift is basically like the hardness of your brush in Photoshop. It's kind of the ZBrush equivalent. So you can go back in and like draw some like creases on the pants or anything like that. And that's, I mean, this is like a awful, awful sculpt, but that's usually how I would add sculpted cloth detail to things. There's different brushes. Like I'm particularly partial to the sort of clay and clay buildup brushes. I don't know why, I just find they work nicely with my workflow. So I'm just gonna, again, sort of make my brush a little bit bigger, and you can see that it just like has a slightly different effect. This one does like more like square lumpy bits. You can also add alphas. So if you ever wanted to do something like a leather texture, you can select a brush to drag that on, and then smooth that if it's like a little bit too intense. They have some really weird alphas that you can do, like these swirls. You can also make your own, but this is good, like if you needed like buttons, you could make your own little black and white button image and just go alpha, import, and pretty much any image will more or less work, I think. Yeah, so you can see it's awful resolution, but it's pretty much using that dagger as like a stencil on my piece. So if you ever need buttons or like weird scroll patterns on your stuff, you can do it that way. And that's honestly more or less how I would sculpt some stuff in Zbrush. So really quick, just let me give you another example of, of how nice the, what am I saying? How nice Decimation Master is. Also Z intensity, kind of like opacity, like the higher the number, the larger blob it's gonna put on your mesh. So I'm just gonna go through and like squirrel a little bit on here. Sorry, it's like 9-hour day. I'm like, all right. So if this is, I'm happy with the way this looks. I'm gonna go Z plugin, Decimation Master, and again, pre-process current. It's gonna take a minute or two. What time is it?
Does the layer menu that you showed up earlier when you have the separate model, does that also help with making layers, like texture-based layers like in Zbrush, or does that not happen in Zbrush?
Honestly, I don't know. Texturing in Zbrush and like modeling from scratch in Zbrush aren't really my thing. It's just like the weird workaround that I found if it makes extra objects in your scene for no apparent reason. I never knew how to fix that, and I just found it recently, and I was like, oh, that's not bad of a fix. Any other questions? No. It is on the lab computers, but the version I got was like $700. But it's such a good program that I did actually pay for it. But yeah, so Zbrush, and again, plugin. I did the pre-process current, so I'm just gonna pick some kind of random percentage, and it's already decimated it. Actually, I can't tell. It's a little bit hard to tell. Yeah, so it's actually already processed this, and I pretty much couldn't even tell that it's like reduced the geometry. So I'm gonna get really aggressive with this just to demonstrate how pretty dang good this is. Like you can still, this is like way lower poly. You can see it's 21,000 instead of like 411 polys. What am I saying? It's significantly less dense, and you still have even like all the detail sort of from that awful dagger stencil that I put in, all the detail from these little squiggle things. So it's really powerful for reducing your meshes. At which point I could just say, all right, I kind of don't hate that. Honestly, for like a 5-inch mesh or whatever, that you're printing this, you probably don't need a whole lot of resolution for it because the printers just can't handle it. If you ever want to build it for larger scale printing eventually, you can totally do that. Extra detail is always kind of fun in my opinion. Did I just call this like clothes? Is that I really need to like pay attention to where I'm putting files. So yeah, so at this point normally I would just drag this back into Maya, and you can see that it has deposited it on my human person, and there is some very awkward sculpting detail that is happening. Normally at this point what I would do is just sort of grab all of the, actually, there's a fun dumb tool in Maya that you can use for this. I would either grab and manually close all the edges, or in this case just do mesh fill hole. And it's actually done a fairly good job for once of going through and just closing all of the seams and like closing, so like the arms are sort of, in the sleeves. For this assignment, you probably don't want a lot of really aggressive, like super thick or like arms that are like going into a tube, because it's gonna be really hard to print. I would say just sort of, where applicable, put your clothes close to the body and just like have them clipping through the body. But yeah, so once you do this, you get end gone, so you gotta do the mesh cleanup option. Okay. Mesh cleanup. Oh wait, I think I just did fill hole again. All right. So again, this would pretty much be ready for booleaning together and printing if you so desired. Just watch out. So like when you're doing the clothes, in this case, like I've made bell bottoms, like this would not print supportless. What would have been probably a better design or like a better shape to start out with is something that sort of flared down and like sat on the floor and then came up at a slight angle over the feet so that you could, again, start printing on the floor and then just kind of deal with that little angle of the pants over the feet. Same thing to an extent, like this area, like right in that sleeve, would have a little bit of issues printing. That might be so small and so close to the print, it might save itself, but like that, again, could potentially cause issues. But that's basically how to make like sort of form-fitting clothes like t-shirts or in this case like bell-bottoms. Anybody have any questions about that? Hmm?
Could I do the same method of getting a shirt and then just extending it down to make a dress?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a better way of doing that?
No, that's pretty much how I would do it. Yeah, and you could do like multiple layers of dress or like whatever you wanted. Honestly, I would probably do, if you were trying to do like a cape or something like that, I'd probably do something really similar where this is going to be horrific looking. I'm just going to make a cylinder with some divisions on it. And I'm just going to say 12 here because I don't want to delete all of these faces manually. Find your cylinder, delete half of the faces. Interesting. Also the ones on the top, and also these. Great. All right, I've deleted part of the stuff I didn't mean to delete. And then if you just throw a, what am I going for? A lattice deformer on this. Like a 2, 2, and 2, apply that. I'm just gonna be really lazy and just use the lattice deformer itself to shift this around the character. And then I can just sort of close the top of this around their neck. And you could make an incredibly awkward cape in this fashion. And then you would basically just have to go through, so I'm just gonna like delete the history on this. So the deformer goes away, grab the vertices, and like here it's obviously clipping through the arm. Maybe like turn on soft select a little bit and just sort of position that so it's not clipping as much through the person and maybe looks like it's sort of falling in a sort of natural position. Perhaps actually this entire side probably would do better from a lattice deformer, but like you can sort of shift that around. And then again, just kind of go through and like sculpt it like you did in Zbrush. Or in this case, actually just shamelessly delete that entire side of polys. And you can do the same thing with like hoods and any other stuff that you did. So if you've like never made clothes before, that's probably like the easiest sort of hacky way I can think to do it. Is to just sort of pose your character and then like model the clothes on top of them. And again, it doesn't need to be like super insanely fancy of a model. Like you could go in and add a lot of really nice detail to this in Zbrush or in Mudbox. Heck, you can even sculpt in Mesh Mixer, and honestly, it's not terrible to work with. And then for something like this, where it's like if you have a cape and it doesn't make sense to like somehow close it off like we did with the shirt, I'm just gonna go with a Mesh Smooth. Select the actual object, Mesh Smooth, great. You can go in and then once it's done, just extrude the entire object. And if this is built to scale, usually I'll do clothes maybe like 0.8 if you're feeling really dangerous, or like 1.2 is usually the thinnest I like to go for that. Millimeters thick, so I'll just set local translate Z to 1.2 millimeters, and then it will thicken this accordingly. And in this case, this is actually scaled on a full-size person, so it looks like super, super thin. But this would be kind of like a good level to print in your stuff. And at this point, you go through and like add any other like little, fasteners to keep this on the neck, that kind of thing. The other thing you could kind of do, which might be interesting, is if you did more sort of like, use this extrude method for more form-fitting pants. You could make the tops a little bit puffy, so like let me actually just real quick cut off the bottom of this dude's legs again. There's another class in here, so I'm trying to like sort of be efficient with this. Again, feel free to stop me if you guys have questions. All right, so one thing you could do is just sort of say, I'm going to extrude this entire thing, just maybe like 1.2 millimeters, enough so you see like that little bit of differentiation between the model. I'm just going to reverse select that. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of the inside again. Ah. Grr. Hi, y'all.
If you're going to delete the inside anyways, why not just scale it up a bit?
Because if you scale it, it's going to change the position on the model. So like if I scaled this, the legs aren't going to be in the right spot, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would usually extrude it, and then I could go through and just grab really quickly. So say there's like, again, ties at the bottom of this leg. Just go through and sort of like expand this so it's a little bit like puffier and more stylized. And you have like one of these awful sort of pants. And then you, ooh, hello. And then you could even sort of flare out the bottom like that. And I'm just sort of imagining, I'll draw on some Tauruses for like the sake of illustration. I've just made some like really ugly barred pants right here. Something like, something kind of like this where there's some like ties going across the leg, or like strings or whatever. So you can like fairly quickly get pretty differentiated pants just by extruding stuff off of your mesh and modifying it. And again, topology doesn't super matter that much since you're printing it and you're probably just going to throw this into ZBrush anyway and like add a bunch of random sculpting detail on it. So that is like more or less the fastest way that I can think to do clothes. We have like 3 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions about that? Cool. Anything else? Cool. In that case, be free. I guess I also have to shift all this stuff into the other print room.